In the Russian night sky, an Aeroflot Airbus A310 is cruising calmly when suddenly the plane starts turning to the right unexpectedly. On the flight deck, confusion soon rises as the aircraft starts turning ever more sharply, seemingly out of control. Just moments later, the pilots fight for their lives as the A310 starts plunging towards the icy ground below. All this is happening while a 15-year-old is occupying the captain's seat. How did this unbelievable accident happen, and how on earth did a 50-year-old make it to the controls of an airliner? Find out with me today in this episode of Airspace. But first, a quick word from today's video sponsor, NordVPN. Do you ever get annoyed by ads that are specifically targeting your area? Or do you ever find yourself running out of Airspace videos and having to watch something on a regular streaming site just to discover that your favorite show isn't available in your area even years after it first aired? Or do you want to find better rates for said streaming service? Then I have a solution for you, NordVPN. NordVPN encrypts your internet traffic, enabling you to browse the web safely, even through unprotected Wi-Fi hotspots. They offer more than 5,000 servers in 60 countries, which enables you to set your virtual location to any of those with just one click. Available on iOS, Android, Windows, Mac, and yes, even Linux. If you'd like to maintain your online privacy and benefit from one of the fastest VPNs out there, check out nordvpn.com/airspace. You'll find the link in the description below as well. Try it out for free, and if you decide to get it, NordVPN offers a 73% discount on 2-year plans if you use my affiliate link. Check it out in the description below. Now let's get back to the video. Aeroflot Flight 593 departed Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport in the late evening for its night flight to Hong Kong. On the flight there were 3 pilots: Captain Andrei Danilov, Relief Captain Yaroslav Kudrinsky, and First Officer Igor Piskarev. After the departure of the A310, Relief Captain Kudrinsky was the first to take a rest. He spent it in the cabin with his daughter, Yana, and son Eldar, who he had brought along for the trip. Aged 12 and 15 years old, the pair was very eager to accompany their dad on his trip. 4 hours into the flight, it was time for Captain Kudrinsky to take over command from Captain Danilov so that the latter could rest. After Captain Danilov had left the cockpit, Captain Kudrinsky offered his daughter to take a seat in the captain's chair in his stead. The first officer did not protest, and as 12-year-old Yana settled into the captain's seat, her father reminded her not to touch anything but the yoke. Fascinated, young Yana asked many questions, much to the endearment of the 2 pilots. Then, her father told her to hold the yoke of the A310 and turn the heading knob of the autopilot a few degrees off course. The aircraft started turning, and to Yana, it must have felt as if she was actually turning the massive plane. After the aircraft had deviated slightly from its course, the captain quickly returned it to the correct path by engaging the navigation mode once more. Delighted, Captain Kudrinsky now offered the same chance to fly the airliner to his 15-year-old son, Eldar. The boy then took his seat at the helm of the 120-ton aircraft. His father then repeated the procedure he had done with Yana. He turned the heading knob while his son held the yoke, giving him the impression that he was actually turning the aircraft. Then he returned the plane to the correct path by engaging the navigation mode. But now, something was different. Eldar, probably nervous in the captain's seat of the massive airliner, gripped the control wheel quite tightly, therefore overriding the autopilot's commands ever so slightly. He constantly applied some right pressure to it, turning the aircraft right at a bank angle that increased only very slowly at about 1 degree per second. This slow rate of turn is not perceptible to somebody who is not looking at the instruments closely. By constantly overriding the autopilot, the boy inadvertently deactivated the roll channel of the autopilot. You see, the Airbus A310 has a very strange feature. If a pilot overrides the commands of the autopilot for longer than 30 seconds, the autopilot decouples, but from the affected channel only. In the case of Aeroflot 593, the captain's son overrode only the roll commands, so the autopilot disconnected from the roll channel. This decoupling was not indicated to the pilots in any way. Now, the A310 was still under pitch and under speed control of the autopilot, but the roll channel was not. Since Eldar continuously applied some right pressure on the control wheel, the aircraft started banking to the right more and more, ever so slightly. The first officer, in the meantime, had moved his seat back almost to the rear stop to be able to more comfortably speak with the family in the cockpit. The first one to notice that something was amiss was Eldar himself when he asked his dad, "Why is it turning?" as the aircraft passed 20 degrees of bank angle. Confused, his dad answered, "It's turning by itself." The The bank angle then increased more and more, and the pilots took no steps to counter the rolling motion. Instead, they discussed why the aircraft would do that. The first officer suggested that the navigation computers had maybe entered a hold for some reason. In the meantime, the bank angle soon increased to 30 degrees, 40 degrees, then exceeded the operating limit of 45 degrees, and eventually reached 50. Since the autopilot was still engaged, it attempted to maintain the assigned altitude, which became more and more difficult. Since turning also decreases the vertical component of the lift generated, the engine spooled up and the autopilot raised the nose, producing ever-increasing G-forces. Eventually, the autopilot raised the nose so high that the A310 stalled. The autopilot immediately disconnected and all hell broke loose in the cockpit. Several alarms sounded and Captain Kudrinski shouted commands at Eldar and the first officer. The latter had difficulties reaching the control column since his seat was so far back, and the young boy was rightfully overwhelmed by the upset aircraft state. Now, as the autopilot had disconnected, the A310's automatic high angle of attack protection engaged, pushing the nose down together with the first officer. The aircraft state now went from stall to overspeed, and the aircraft headed towards the ground at an almost 90 degrees bank angle. It quickly reached descent speeds of almost 40,000 feet per minute and exceeded the maximum operating speed. First Officer Piskarev then attempted to recover normal flight by rolling the plane back to wings level and then pulling the control column. He did so, but pulled way too hard, pitching the aircraft up rapidly. The maneuver generated G-loads of almost 5 G. While Piskarev was trying to pull out of the dive, Captain Kudrinski shouted to Eldar to get out of the seat, but that was almost impossible due to the high G-forces and the limited space in the cockpit. Co-pilot Piskarev's pull-up maneuver exceeded the operating limits of the aircraft by a large margin, and permanent deformations of the control surfaces occurred. Also, he pulled so hard that the aircraft soon started climbing back into the night sky, with its nose almost 90 degrees upwards. In that attitude, airspeed dropped extremely quickly, and soon the aircraft stalled once more. At the top of its ascent, the plane also became weightless for a short time. During these precious moments, the captain was able to remove his son from his seat and take control once more. But now, he was faced with an aircraft that had stalled and was starting to develop a dangerous condition called a spin. In a spin, the aircraft is effectively stalled and rotating around its own vertical axis. Spin recovery is hard in a small aircraft and is never trained in airliners, although the recovery technique is theoretically the same. Confused shouts now filled the cockpit, with the two pilots disagreeing whether their speed was high or low. They did not really comprehend what was happening and struggled to exit the spin. The captain even kicked the rudder this way and that in a desperate attempt to regain control. But the aircraft had reached a dangerously low altitude by that point. Alas, it was too late when the captain finally managed to wrestle his way back into control. The plane was now fully controllable once more, but at this point, the aircraft was at an altitude of only 400 meters and descending rapidly. The A310 slammed into the ground with such violence that the aircraft broke apart immediately, killing all of the 75 occupants instantly. The crash site was located in the area of the Kuznetsk's Alatau mountain range, a remote area in the southern part of Russia. It was quickly evident that nobody could have survived the impact. The flight data recorders were subsequently found on the second day of the investigation. Initially, Aeroflot declined the allegations that one of their captains had brought his kids to the cockpit and had offered them a seat in his chair. But when a Moscow-based magazine published the entire transcript of the cockpit voice recorder about half a year after the crash, the airline had no other way than to admit what had happened. Eventually, the official final report on the accident was published, and it rightfully named the actions of Captain Kudrinski as the root cause of the crash. It also criticized the flight crew for not recognizing early enough that the aircraft was entering a dangerous condition. At any time, the co-pilot could have returned the A310 to wings level and nothing would ever have happened. Instead, the crew focused too much on why the aircraft was turning away from its intended path instead of correcting that mistake. The investigators also criticized the pilots for their lack of discipline, evident in the fact that they let an outsider fly the aircraft, moved their seats back to the almost fully rearward position during flight, and so on. But the investigators also found fault with some of Airbus's design choices. They strongly suggested that the disconnection of one of the autopilot channels should have an associated oral or visual warning. The complete lack of such a warning is astonishing, and I can't really think of a good reason why Airbus would design a system in that way. Also, the committee thought that it would be prudent for Airbus to introduce bank angle warnings to its flight warning computers. Most other aircraft types warn their pilots if a bank angle of 45 degrees is exceeded, but to this day, most Airbus planes remain without such a warning. In the end, this accident was a case of a baffling amount of negligence and complacency on the flight crew's part. Having a little fun here and there in the flight deck is great, but the pilots in this case just showed an amazing lack of professionalism. At the end of the day, their actions claimed the life of the 75 souls on board. And that was the incomprehensible and tragic story of Aeroflot 593. If you'd like to see more aviation videos, check out the links in the outro. Thanks also to my supporters on Patreon. You guys make these videos possible. See you all in the next one.